Hello friends, thank you for joining me. In this video I'm going to give you some information about how to make sure that you are assessing your ELL students in your mainstream classroom effectively and fairly. It seems like in the past this hasn't been something that people really considered, but now that there's been education reform and there's standard-based learning and all students are expected to achieve at these really high levels, which is super. But not all students are the same, so some of them will need some accommodations in order to reach the same heights as other students. So hopefully with this information I give you, you can use it as a measuring stick of sorts to ensure that you are also assessing your ELL students fairly. All the information that I'm providing here I got from a book called Standards-Based Instruction for English Language Learners by Mary Ann Lachey. I read it for my education 580 EDU 581 class at Georgetown College. It is a major page turner and I highly recommend you purchase it. So here are some guiding questions from the book that you should consider when trying to determine whether or not you are assessing your English language learning students equally and fairly as other students. The opportunity to learn. You have to consider whether or not your students have had the chance to actually learn the material you are assessing them on. Not only have they learned it, have they had time to prepare to show you that they have learned it in whatever task you're asking them to complete. Are you trained? Are there other teachers actually trained? Do they have the quality training and experience that culturally and linguistically diverse students, such as English language learners, need in order to have effective instruction? And are you using all of the best available resources available to you, be it books, materials, technology? If there is something at your school that you can use to make learning or the learning environment better for your students, I stress that you do so. Validity. Well, you have to make sure that the test or assessment that you are giving your ELL students, or your entire class for that matter, you have to make sure that it's actually been validated before by other culturally and linguistically diverse students. You can't necessarily give a test to English language learners that has only ever been given to monolingual students before. That's not fair. You're not necessarily going to be judging their actual content, their knowledge of the content. You're going to be, intentionally or not, also measuring their language proficiency, and that's not the point. You can't do that. That makes the results invalid. So a way that the culturally and linguistically diverse students can validate tests is making sure that the test actually considers their cultural backgrounds, and that it is informative to them, it is meaningful to them, that it has something that they can look back at and remember. And also, if a test has been translated, if you've done it or if you've had somebody else do it, you have to make sure that that translation itself is actually valid. So something that Lachey recommends doing is back translation, which essentially is having it translated back and forth through languages at least 3 times. So if you have an English test that you're translating into Spanish, you would then take that Spanish test, translate it back into English, English back into Spanish, Spanish back into English, to make sure that all the concepts are still there and that nothing has been lost in language. Relevant prior knowledge. Well, you have to determine what common experiences and understandings students must have in order to achieve in the assessment. If it's based on something that they have no experience with, then they're not going to achieve. Along those same lines, make sure that your students have some way to connect their own cultural background and experiences to what you're asking them to do in the task. Make sure you yourself are aware of the information that they're going to need to be able to use in order to succeed in the task being asked of them. And make sure the students know exactly what you are looking for from them. Research shows basically that the more that is expected of students, and when they know what is expected of them, the more likely they are to achieve. I can't tell you exactly who said that, but I know I read it in Lachey's book. Language demands and content bias. So, when you're creating an assessment task or even just an activity, you have to determine what language demands are needed in order to complete the task. Especially when it comes to higher order thinking skills. is what you're asking them to do within their realm of possibilities as far as language goes. Not content, but within language. Especially important in mainstream classes is making sure that if a task isn't primarily meant to assess language facility, which commonly in the mainstream classroom, except for maybe the exception of language arts, it probably isn't. It's going to be testing their content knowledge. See what alternative options for displaying their understanding are available. So give them multiple opportunities to show you what they know. Don't just give them a test and expect them to show you that they have mastered the concept within the test, because it doesn't work that way. If they can't do it in one way, give them an option to do it in another way. Are the concepts, vocabulary, and activities important to the assessment test familiar to all students to be tested, regardless of their background? They have to know the vocabulary that is being used in order to achieve. Are the range of knowledge and ways of expressing knowledge called for in the assessment familiar only to the mainstream culture? You have to make it relevant to them. Procedural bias and scoring criteria. So again, you have to make sure that your assessments aren't penalizing students just because they don't know the test format, for example. If you have a student who has recently moved from Mexico who isn't familiar with Scantron tests, testing them exclusively with the Scantron test isn't necessarily fair. They might not know how to use it. They aren't going to know necessarily how to beat the odds. Are they given sufficient time to complete an assessment? Don't give students a 10-page assessment and expect them to do it in 20 minutes. You couldn't do that with any student. You have to recognize how long it's going to take every single student to take a test or to finish an assessment and give them the time to do so. You want to make sure that you're not testing their time management skills per se, but their content knowledge, although time management skills are important as well. Make sure you know what accommodations are needed in order to give the English language learners the same chance to do well as the native English-speaking students in your class. And make sure that your scoring criteria that you're using to grade or to judge their performance isn't biased just towards the mainstream culture. It has to be for all students, culturally and linguistically diverse, native English speakers, so on and so forth. If you aren't going to be the one who's actually scoring an assessment or an assessment task, make sure the people who are also familiar with the students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Again, you do not want somebody who is unaware that you have English language learners in your class judging their performance on the task, because they might take into account the language proficiency when it's not necessarily something that should be confusing the score. You want to make sure that whoever is doing the scoring is actually scoring the student's knowledge and the performance of what the student was asked to do, and not their language capabilities. Well, I hope that gave you some guidelines that you can potentially follow to ensure that you are fairly and equally assessing your English language learning students. And of course, these are all tips that you can use in any classroom, whether or not you have an English language learner or you just have native English speaking students in your class. Making sure that all of your students know what they're being assessed on, that nothing is biased, that the assessments are validated. All of that is important to ensure that you actually get a good measurement of what your students have learned in class, and that you can take that information from the assessments and let it help improve your actual instruction. So thanks for joining me, and have a good day.